And with me today, I have Professor Dame Celia Hoyles, Chair of Mathematics Education at the IOE. Much of Celia's research has been concerned with using digital technology to support learning in maths. She's developed many digital learning tools, including, most recently, Cornerstone Maths and Scratch Maths. Now, these have opened up access to maths to many more learners around the world, and they've also built understanding of how we learn. Also today we have Dr. John Potter, Associate Professor of Media in Education at the IOE. John's research interests include creative agency and learner agency, the use of social software and online networks for learning, and the changing nature of teaching and learning in response to media technologies. John is himself a former primary school teacher, local authority advisor for ICT and teacher educator. So to start off the Q&A, now, John and Celia, you each work in quite different ways with digital technology to support learning. Can I start by asking you both for your views on the opportunities and pitfalls that learning in a digital context presents?
I'll start with the pitfalls, if you don't mind, because these are really the more obvious things. I mean, clearly, if you're using any sort of digital technology, it has to work. And for those of us who are doing a lot of stuff online now, it's very stressful when it doesn't work very well. So that's first. And then you have to make sure there's enough of it. I mean, when there's a shortage of some sort of computers or digital technology, who is going to dominate it? Who's going to take over this? I mean, like now, we're all online. Is our broadband going to be sufficient to cope with this? So if we put that aside and all those obvious pitfalls are overcome, then what are the potential? As Sandy said, I've worked in the potential of digital technologies for learning maths for many years. And I think there's plenty of evidence that there is potential in opening access to mathematics, because there are different ways of looking at your mathematical objects. Before, you could only look at it through some static paper and pencil way, usually symbolic, like with algebra. But now there's lots of other ways that are dynamic, visual, more engaging. So I'm absolutely certain that the learners can actually see the mathematical objects in multiple ways, can link these multiple ways, and see mathematics for what it is. And what is important in this is the learners have, I mean, what we would say intellectual empowerment. So they actually see, by using these tools, they really can achieve something instead of just learning something that's been given them on high. So I think there's a huge amount of potential. I can easily come back to you later and give you some examples. I think in mathematics, which has obviously a very central place in schools and colleges, sometimes people just don't see the point. Where is the wow factor? What's the fuss about? And I think we have to show just a little glimpse of that in schools. Thank you.
How about you, John?
Well, thanks, Celia. I mean, I think that one of the effects of the lockdown has been to force us into thinking a little bit more about digital technology in education and media in education, in the sense that we've all been forced to move into an online teaching experience, perhaps more rapidly, more quickly, the word is pivot towards it. And that sometimes has brought great success and sometimes huge challenge. And that's at all phases of education. So my children are both teachers. One is a primary school teacher, one is a secondary school teacher, and I work in higher education. And there are certain commonalities with the ways in which we've all kind of responded to it. And I was talking to them both about this at the weekend. So some things are made more visible, more interesting, more useful, and other things are much, much more difficult. I think that one of the biggest issues that we face is the potential inequality that results. So if we do pivot entirely online and schools are somehow made to disappear overnight, there is a massive problem of inequality, both of equipment and of access to bandwidth and all of the rest of it. And that's the massive elephant in the room that really can't be ignored. And so in both the schools that they work in, they have made efforts to distribute equipment, but it's a funding issue. And if that is going to be a kind of hybrid version of teaching and learning, we need to somehow make that a real possibility with both equipment and bandwidth. Having said that, there are undoubtedly positives to it, and Celia's alluded to agency, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think that in both cases, both my children report that there are children that they teach who actually enjoy being able to be flexible with when they do certain things, and also at how fast they work, and they can be much more individual. One of the downsides of that is that they lose the sense of where their peers are, and for teachers, it can be difficult to do that thing that good teachers do of reading a room. So you're not there co-present, and there isn't that embodiment and affect that you get in a really brilliant, buzzy classroom. But the upside of some of that is that for some people, it works really well being able to learn at a certain pace if they have the space within their house. Because before this happened, there was this phenomenon known as bring your own device, BYOD, into school. So there was this idea that maybe students who were lucky enough to have the equipment could bring in their tablets and phones and whatnot. But now we have the other way on, which is this BYOSH, which is bring your whole school home, bring your own school home with you. And that's a kind of invasion of the home space, and either it's going to be a kind of something that benefits that space, or it can be a threat to the norms and regimes of that space. So the jury's out. There are definite gains, but there are some losses, and I do have serious concerns about the inequality aspect.
So, what do you think is going to be the future of this then? Because we've been rather thrown in at the deep end. You know, schools have had a very tightly controlled time and space for learning. People like Gibbons wrote even 30 years ago about the way online learning leads to this distanciation, if you like. And we're very used to that, very comfortable with that. And then almost overnight, we go to a funky model where it's very random, and it's quite alarming, isn't it? And there's a lot of debate about the sort of quality of the home and what people are seeing behind the screen. I know that at IOE we've actually got, for when we're using Teams, we have special backgrounds that we can put there, so you don't have to see my pinboard and things like that. So there's a lot of awareness of that, and there's also an awareness of the fact that, you know, suddenly kids have gone a bit free range and they can do the learning at any time of the day or night, and they're not necessarily on the clock anymore. So I'm just wondering what the future is then in terms of schooling and online learning, if we've let everybody off the leash so far, so suddenly. Celia, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I do, and I certainly want to reiterate what John said. I mean, undoubtedly, there's a massive problem of inequality in terms of access. There's always been an inequality in terms of digital technologies, and it could be made worse, without doubt. And I do think that maybe the future could be better, because now parents and families now maybe see that teaching is not quite such a simple thing, as long as this online learning isn't seen as delivery. This is what I see as a major potential obstacle, because we can all give lectures, you know, all of us, like John and you, we can give a lecture. It's a bit more stressful giving it online, because you've got to work to make sure the media works and you can share your PowerPoint. But learning is not just lecturing, it's actually interaction. As John said, looking through the room, making sure you are connecting to that student who looks disaffected and asking them the right question. And actually, what's important, seeing what they're doing. Now, there are ways of doing this online, but I know in mathematics, actually, if you just have a glance of what the students are writing, you get a window on their particular ideas. And I think that is really crucial, so that your intervention can be a bit adaptive. Now, I think it can be done online, but I think it's a challenge that we've got to think out. But in terms of the future too, one of the things I think would be just wonderful if we could be better at adapting to the learner, but also showing that these barriers between school, which is usually in its own little world, certainly in STEM subject, you do things in school and then you do things in the outside world, at work, or in looking at the world. And mathematics, for example, is everywhere, and school maths is this separate little box. And if only we could break out that box, it would be really good for my subject and indeed for learning. So I can see as it being better to adapt to the learner, and also really showing the power, intellectual power of our subject by getting out of its school box. Thank you.
John.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with everything that you said there. I think that the emphasis that you give to agency is really important in that. And some of the most exciting things that certainly that I've been involved with have been where we've seen children making their own productions, creating their own content, because learning is not just content delivery. It's also about learning about how messages are made, and it's about media. I mean, I'd like to see media education on the curriculum from the very earliest years now. It makes no sense to have a school curriculum which has that absence in it. That kind of lacuna in 2020 is slightly crazy. And other education systems are, of course, investing in multiliteracies and in working with children about how messages are made and shared. And I'm thinking about Finland with their new multiliteracy curriculum. So that's my bit of preaching maybe to the converted, to some of the people who are watching anyway. But no, agency is very, very important. And I think it's always been a part of the message that Celia has given about the way maths is learned, and about the way that it's not just about having something delivered to you, but it's about a student being adaptable and about trying out ideas. And some of the computing curriculum is very much that kind of asking that what if question. And certainly we see it in media where people are making animations or film productions. There's such a lot of other curriculum activity that goes in around this. Some of it's mathematical, some of it's social, and all of it's got that kind of creative edge that is really, really interesting. We see it in students that are consuming and creating TikTok videos, for example, and some of that is really quite thrilling to see.
So it sounds like there's quite a positive future on the horizon, but I know that a lot of teachers are in the middle of the here and now. And we've had one question from Loyana Leal asking, what top tips have you got for teachers in this situation? And, at the Institute, we're often sort of on a bit of a tightrope when it comes to the top tips question, because, we like people to sort of spend years thinking about things very deeply. But we all teach as well, so we do actually get our hands dirty on a daily basis. So Celia, I'm just wondering if you had to give, say, a relatively newly qualified teacher 3 useful pieces of advice about this, what might they be?
Yes. Well, I've learned a few things, so I have a top tip for myself that may be helpful. This is in this new normal that we are. I've given quite a few lectures all on these different platforms, and I actually have got myself in a real anxious state about it, because suddenly there you are with your laptop and you have no support, it's just you. And I read a small document from one of my colleagues in the lab, Eileen Kennedy, who was talking about MOOCs. And she said you can reduce the anxiety by doing some things on video. And I thought, what a great idea. I had thought of that. Now, I don't know whether this is possible for teachers, but to do some of your lectures, at least you've got something there that you can send them in case everything fails you. And the other top tip is the importance of design. I mean, nothing is going to happen inevitably. That's why people like us three and other people at the Institute of Education, we have been working very hard on designing learning activities that have the potential to help, that have the potential to provoke interaction. But nothing is inevitable. Just by being online, or just is called, Seymour Papert used to call it technocentrism. It used to drive me mad when people said, if you have an interactive whiteboard, everything will be wonderful. Having an interactive whiteboard is neither here nor there. It's how you use it. So I think my top tip is to find some really good learning resources that have some evidence base. And that's crucial for us as researchers, that they really do have potential. There's a lot of stuff out there that is not evidence-based and is not designed with the new tools in mind and with proper learning goals in mind. So I don't know how many top tips I've given, but I've given a few. Make sure the pedigree's right, and make sure, of course, that it suits your aims and objectives. Thank you.
Yeah, because sometimes people are a bit worried about curating other people's material, aren't they? And I
Yeah.
think, one of the things that I've been saying to a lot of colleagues who've had to flip their courses over to online very quickly because of lockdown is, don't be afraid of just putting together a bundle of stuff that's just really educationally sound. You don't have to invent it all. You don't
No,
write
no.
every textbook you use. So you shouldn't be necessarily creating all the content. It's the way you put it together that's the instructional design. And also not to overlook things like podcasts and so on, just to add a little bit of multimedia content. Again, you don't have to be, a program maker doing a really whizzy presentation when you can just do small pieces of multimedia material that bolt together to make something really worthwhile. So I think that's something that we all encourage colleagues to take into account, isn't it? Now, John, you're the sort of media education specialist, so you're immersed in film and sound and that kind of thing. What could you add, do you think?
I think it's important to remember that digital education is not just in a vacuum. It's part of a culture. And when I think people are excited about screens and screen teaching, you have to remember that children, young people, all of us actually, are immersed in visual culture. So it's not possible to compete with some of the big budget productions or some of the absolutely excellent stuff that's already out there. So I think the message is, don't be daunted by any of that. People appreciate you having a go at things. And if you look at the quality of something that entertains you on TikTok, for example, it's not always the top um, technological marvel or media marvel that it might seem to be. Sometimes it's a very, very simple idea. I think Celia's right to point to Eileen's work for university lecturers specifically, which is about creating stuff in advance that you film in advance. And I think I'd do the same if I were working in school. And I know that both of my children do that. You can't do a synchronous piece of teaching very, very easily. And certainly for those of us working in higher education, again, you get the equality issue. If we do everything synchronously, we're disadvantaging people with low bandwidth, we're disadvantaging some of our students who are not in the same time zone as us. So we have to have a good balance. And I think that the response of the university has been great. I think for education, I've heard of some schools which are pushing things out in much the same way as usual, and have got really high expectations on homes and on parents to become teachers, parents and carers. But I'm pleased to hear about schools who've sent messages home saying, just do what you can. And I think the same applies to teachers. I think that teaching is hard enough, and especially picking up a newspaper of a certain kind and reading that you're particularly lazy individuals who aren't really doing anything. I know that teachers have been working desperately hard during this lockdown period to reach their pupils, and I pay tribute to them for the efforts that they make, because they've been incredible, really. I think as far as learners go, if you're in teaching, I think one assumption would be to have no assumptions. So please don't follow the well-worn cliche of digital natives. You'll find that there are students and children that you're teaching that have no idea about how to navigate a laptop. This was pointed out to me by my son, actually, who said the students that he works with in secondary school are well used to tablets and they're well used to phones, but they don't know about file systems. They don't know where they put their work. We don't have ICT lessons anymore for that kind of stuff. So you need to do a lot of work on that. So don't make any assumptions that because they're all digital natives, an awful phrase, that they are, somehow much better and better than you are at everything. Ask them frequently how things are going and whether they like the resources that they'll be honest with you. Do you like learning in this way? Much of my research all down the years has been participant led. I like to talk to people about how they're feeling about what they're doing and not assume that I've got it right. And I think that's something that's a top tip, actually. Regularly talk to your learners about how they're feeling about this, and ask for their advice and their support. And don't pretend to be an expert in the whole thing. We're just learning about how all this is going.
Yes, there's a lot to be said for the weekly asynchronous forum, isn't there, where people can post things, and also you know, one of the things I know a lot of colleagues do at the IOE is at week 5 at the half-time point, try to have some kind of feedback opportunity. So you've got time to change the course before the end of term. So, you know, there's some very useful things to think about there. And we're getting some really interesting questions in from members of the public. So, for example, are there ways of reading a room online? You know, apart from the forum approach. Celia, what do you think? How would you get a sense of what students are thinking?
Actually, I wish I knew. I found it really hard because I really think that it's important to catch people's eye and see if people are engaged and to get gauge the depth of engagement, not just being there, but actually really focusing. And I don't know how to do that. I mean, I've been in classes with a lot of people, and you can see a few faces, and actually the number of people I've asked, parents who've been educating their kids at home or even their grandkids at a distance, I do think that's really hard to see, to read even a small number about what they're doing. So I don't know. I'd really like to know, because we've got lots of signals you can make. But if somebody really doesn't want to make those signals and they're way away from you, I think it's really quite hard myself.
You can't see if they're looking out the window, really.
Exactly. Or if they're hiding under the table while you're supposed to be touching them, all those things. It's not so easy.
John, what do you think?
Yes, so just to continue that for a moment, Sandy, if the mute is on and the camera's off as well, you know, on WhatsApp, Facebook, or even probably not Facebook anymore. I mean, yeah, I think that it is really difficult to work out attention anyway. In a classroom, it takes a lot of skill to sort of get to that stage where you're reading a room successfully. I think online there are some obvious indicators, but a lot of the interfaces that we use are not really as friendly as social media or the media that is useful that is easily usable to express emotion quickly. Think about the visual way that people use emoticons and so forth in other platforms. Many of the tools that we use to do any kind of teaching at a synchronous moment come from an office environment, come from video conferencing for business. You know, Microsoft Teams is not easily adaptable to a school setting, and neither in its own way is Zoom, to say nothing of all the privacy issues and safeguarding issues that you have with doing synchronous work with children at home. And there are schools that quite rightly, certainly in the beginning of Zoom, have banned it because there was no end-to-end encryption initially. But you could think of ways around that where for privacy, you as a school sent out a background that you said that if we're going to do synchronous work, we need this background on. We don't want to see your home. We don't want to see other people in there. We want to talk to you. That there are little ways around it. And then perhaps you could have everybody's face on screen and do a quick scan. But even so, it's incredibly difficult. And part of the problem is that we all of us try to map onto the online world what has come in from the offline world. Sometimes there's a good match and a good affordance and a good similarity, but other times things are not do not easily translate. And one of them is reading the room. That doesn't translate.
That's very difficult, isn't it? It's interesting what you said about kind of needing to poll people, needing to check. I just had a comment in from our organisational team saying they're going to try and have a poll about whether broadband should be a human right on Twitter. So everybody keep an eye out for that, because we're trying to read the room as well. We've had a really interesting question from Caroline Norris that I know both of you would really have a lot to say about. And that is, what do you think the opportunities are to use digital tech to support learning of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities? Celia.
Well, it's not my particular area, but I do know some really important work has been done actually about this, supporting disadvantaged students with educational needs. Way back, actually, the idea, so many of them who maybe couldn't speak very well could use their digital joystick or whatever it was. Actually, I don't know if any of you remember the turtle, but I remember seeing a video of Sylvia Weir, who worked in this area, MIT, and she gave the opportunity for this kid who was terribly disabled to press something, and it got that turtle to move. And I remember to this day, and it was ages ago that this happened, the joy on this face of this kid, because they had some sort of empowerment. So I think that digital tools, if carefully designed, it won't just happen without design and thought. And I know there are people, Lulu Healy at King's, for example, is one of them, who've really thought carefully about students who are blind or deaf, and how can be enabled to engage in learning through digital tools. So I think it's massively exciting, that work, but it needs to be really thought through very carefully.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And some years and years ago, going to the BET show when it was a sort of much less corporate and smaller event, one of the most exciting spaces to go into, and it probably still is actually, was the Special Needs Village, as it was known then, where you have people working on really exciting, bespoke access and so on for pupils of all sorts of needs. But I think it really begs the question of what education is for and how you're educating. So the New Zealand curriculum, for example, starts with a statement about educating for the few, for the minorities, and for those with different kinds of needs. Because if you have that as your focus in the first place, you end up educating for the many. So I would say that, and tech and media has a very good part to play in that. And there's all sorts of brilliant research going on about it. And sometimes this picture of disability as something as a problem that needs solving isn't helpful, but it's more helpful to think about everybody having a different place on a spectrum of life and access to living,
Mm.
and making sure that your technology continually reflects that back. I think would be a great thing if that happened in the future.
I was really interested to hear you mention the turtle, Celia, because our
Yes.
former director, Jeff Whitty, wrote a paper about
Yes.
the whole kind of democratization of coding
Mm.
through the turtle. And it was designed to be a really subversive tool, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes wonder if there's a tension between people trying to be very subversive in schools with tech and use it for all sorts of purposes, and the corporatization that John mentioned that's trying to force it into a mold. And I see this particularly when I'm researching artificial intelligence in education, and this kind of, you know, homespun versus corporate model. And I'm hoping it's never resolved, because I hope teachers feel that they can be creative with the tech and use it really for all sorts of things for their pupils. I'm just looking at some more questions that we've had in from the public. Mel Bond has asked whether you think it's important that teachers prioritise aligning the tech to particular curriculum and goals, rather than, you know, what I was saying earlier about not being afraid to curate other people's content. Do you think that there's a difficulty there in using other people's materials but getting them aligned to what you're trying to do?
I'll start. I mean, I want to mention one thing. I mean, having involved in computing, as you said, with Logo way back, and you mentioned in my introduction, we work with Scratch now. The whole point about that is you can align your Scratch programs to what it's a programming language, so it can be used for anything. So part of the whole role of programming, and why indeed I got involved in it, is exactly so you could align it to your particular goals. And I want to just mention one thing, actually, a bit getting in from the backfield, if you don't mind, but we do have a national computing curriculum where everybody has to learn to program from age 6 up to 16. And I think this is incredible potential if we can only grasp it. I mean, we now are going to have children, learners coming out of school who really know how to program, who really know how to adapt stuff to their own needs. And okay, it will be done in computing, but in Scratch Maths, we use that potential in mathematics. It doesn't have to be in mathematics. It could be in history. It could be in science. There is such potential here in terms of how we can align these new digital innovations to our own goals. But it won't necessarily happen unless all of us work on it and design stuff that's going to help it happen.
Yeah,
John?
I mean, I think it's about having an educational vision for yourself anyway, so that if the question is about taking other people's material off the shelf and using it, I don't think that the digital or the media and education world is unique to this. And I think if even before technology, 30 years ago made an entrance into the classroom, there was still the problem of how do you work with content that has been provided by someone else. I think now the difficulty is how do you stop? How do you turn the tap off for a moment and contemplate what it is you're actually looking at? Because we're awash with potential solutions. Um, do you buy into the world of one particular package? Do you allow your curriculum to start to align with that? I think it really boils down to aligning it with the particular values you have about teaching and learning and about wider life. And it's about working as a team in a school to look at these materials first and think, do they align with our values? Do they educate for the many and not just, the few? How does this work equitably across our pupil population? What's the best way to do it? So sometimes it will be materials that align more closely with what pupils are doing outside. So maybe there's a connection with popular culture or gaming that might be quite useful to explore. And sometimes it's a more formal kind of engagement. But whatever happens, you have to have your own pedagogical vision as a group, as a staff group, and you have to weigh up all of the materials and options that are being thrown at you and say, does this fit for our local area? Does this fit for the pupils that are in front of us? And what values do these materials represent? And make sure that they're the right ones.
Mm.
Thank you. So that gives teachers some idea about the way forward there. I just wanted to announce that while we've been speaking, we've had the results in from our Twitter poll. Is broadband a human right now? And yes, won by 90%. No is 10%. I thought you'd like to know that. I'd like to just touch on one final point because we've just got 5 minutes left now. Now, one of the things that particularly parents looking at education from the outside will be seeing is that a lot of online learning tools don't seem very serious if you're used to a very formal textbook model of learning. They're often quite like computer games and very play-based. Do children really learn from that kind of model of education? What do you think, Celia?
Well, as with everything, it's a balance. I mean, clearly in learning maths or STEM subjects, you must explore in order to gain that agency, as John has said. You can learn just by listening, for sure you can. I've learned a lot by listening to inspirational people, or indeed by reading books and just reading maths books, if you like, and really being inspired by them. But I think when you really make it your own, you really got to have some interaction with this. So I think whether that's just a game, I think games have a wonderful place, but it depends on the design. If it's just a rather trivial game, which I must say in maths, there are lots of rather trivial games where you get a prize if you've gone up a level. I hate them because I don't really see that the playing of the game is part of the learning process. So I think it can be, but I think it need not be. I keep going on batting on about design. It all depends. And actually, what John said, what our vision for learning is. My vision is that we engage people, and it's the process of logical argument and reasoning in the construction of the game and your response to the game that's really important. Thank you.
So it's really a quality issue, isn't it, Celia?
Yeah.
John, what do you think?
Well, I think that I think that we learn our first experiences in the world are learning through play. And play. There's a professor of play now at Cambridge who'd probably agree with this. I hope so. But it allows you to explore provisionality on the world and to ask yourself from a very young age, kind of what if questions, and the best ways in which maybe the computing curriculum is being taught, or a media curriculum could be taught, would be to say, if I put things together in this way, what kind of message does it produce? What kind of thing does it say about me? Has it communicated? Has it made meaning in some way? So play and being playful with media and being playful with technology allows us to ask lots of provisional type questions on the world and to become better problem solvers ultimately. And it does tie in with what Celia was saying about exploration. It's how we first encounter the world and how we get to know it. And I've no problem with a play-based curriculum at all. And very, very little of what children do when they're playing is actually trivial. It might be trivial, or it might not be. It might be rehearsing something. It might be learning something brand new. But I think that there's a huge amount of value in that.
Can I ask the question?
Quickly,
John?
2 minutes.
The trouble is with the what if questions. Sometimes if they're not curated by a more expert person, it can send you around a terrible blind alley, and you can never get out of it. We called it the play paradox. And
yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Celia. And I think that just to contextualize further, then, when I say play from the earliest years is of enormous value, I think what it is it helps to create a disposition towards learning in a particular sort of way. So I think we can harness that by being good teachers and by having a pedagogy that's designed around a curriculum that allows you to make constructs and test them out. And I think in play, but I think that there's an absolutely crucial role that you've alluded to, which is having a pedagogical design and having a purpose and owning the values and the pedagogy in that.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, very wise words. Very sadly, we're out of time now, so we'll have to leave it there. I'm really sorry we couldn't get through more questions, but thank you so much for sending them in, everybody. So thank you for joining us. And huge thank you to our speakers, Celia Hoyles and John Potter. Stay safe, everybody. Stay alert. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.